I need your help. We need to play this game called Iconoclasts.
But I don't want to play a Metroidvania.
But this one's a little different, Morty. Looks just like a mascot platformer from the 90s. Make you feel good inside. It'll be awesome.
I don't know, Rick. I heard things about it. Weird things. This might not be a good idea.
Oh, wow, Morty. Wow. You're gonna listen to people on the internet? Come on, in and out. Chenner's feel-good adventure.
Why was its story so dark?
She ripped his arm off, Morty. Clean off!
What was up with that bird guy?
There was like white skeleton juice everywhere. It was so messed up. Why would anyone ever do that? They even make you jump through it. Why were the trees slimy? It was so gross.
Is everything I ever believed in a lie?
Then she turned into an Akira monster, but she just wouldn't let go, Morty. She kept holding onto that rocket. What a great game.
Robin's just your average 17-year-old girl who likes doing what your average 17-year-old girl likes to do. Turn wrenches and not get killed by their oppressive theocratic government. Unfortunately for her, Robin's turned one too many wrenches for the one concern's liking. You see, Robin hasn't been sanctioned to be a mechanic and thus is forbidden to touch one concern's machinery with her unblessed hands, lest she taints the machine's sacred energy source, a white liquid called ivory mined from the planet. As no good deed goes unpunished, Robin's selfless nature draws ire from one concern. With cruel and swift precision, government agents destroy Robin's family's home with her family still in it and drag her off to prison. After escaping her cell with her new pirate friend, Robin clutches her unholy wrench and sets off to dismantle the corrupt hierarchy that's taken everything away from her and so many others. Iconoclasts is a special game. I tried playing it years ago and couldn't get into it, so I dropped it after only a couple of hours. I recently picked it back up and, surprisingly, I had a great time this go round because Iconoclasts is, in fact, a great video game. I think my initial disinterest was due to my misplaced expectations. Iconoclasts is not a good Metroidvania. Yes, it is technically a Metroidvania, but like how a hot dog is technically a sandwich or a tomato is technically a fruit. It checks off all the boxes it needs to fulfill the definition of Metroidvania, but we all know it's something else. Much like how one would presume a fruit to be sweet, so too would one presume a Metroidvania to prioritize exploration. Yet, despite its cheery and bright opening moments, Iconoclasts is neither sweet nor a game focused on exploring. If I had to properly categorize Iconoclasts, I'd say it's a narrative-driven puzzle platformer with Metroidvania undertones. Seems like a silly description, but setting expectations is vital when starting a new game. Once I tempered my expectations as to what Iconoclasts really is, I was finally able to enjoy it for what it was. And what it was something fantastic. Combat in Iconoclasts, however, was not fantastic. It didn't do anything egregious, everything worked and felt and sounded good, but combat just wasn't the game's focus. Again, we're dealing with a puzzle platformer here, so combat was simplistic. Robin starts with a wrench to bop stuff and a stun gun to shoot stuff. She can also stomp on things and eventually get some weapon upgrades like a gun that launches rolling bombs or an electrified wrench. The game's cleverness shines with each upgrade as increasing your combat capabilities also adds to your puzzle solving tools and your means of traversing Robin's world. For instance, the rolling bombs are great against enemies below you and their explosions are also perfect for moving special platforms. And using your electrified wrench on zip lines to bust up blocks? Easily the most satisfying thing in the game. You'll need to understand each of your weapon's alternative puzzle-solving uses to advance, but none of the puzzles are real head-scratchers. They're engaging, and some aren't pushovers, but they're all mostly order of operations affairs. Do this first, then that, then boom, solved. Puzzles here are more about execution than critical thinking. My one critique about making a Metroidvania puzzle platformer is that there were times I thought I could solve a puzzle, but really I couldn't until I found the necessary tool. This situation was uncommon as most puzzles could be solved as you uncovered them, but once I had that one moment where I genuinely lacked the tools, I approached every situation like, am I missing a tool or am I too stupid to solve this? This uncertainty led me to skipping optional content because I didn't know if I could do it yet. Then, I just forget about it and never return. But combat wasn't a complete bust. All the boss battles were cool and interesting and were a great marriage of combat and puzzle solving. Most were a spectacle, some were intense, all were a blast. I played the game on the standard difficulty, and I was able to defeat each boss on my first try. For you folks listening who've played the game, I'd say my favorite was the Carver, the metal worm in the circular tunnel. It's a thrilling fight, and the ending was just so funny I actually laughed out loud. But more on the game's humor and tone later. Rounding off the gameplay, there's not a whole lot of customization for Robin. You can craft and equip these things called tweaks, but they're pretty inconsequential. I had the same 3 equipped the entire game because I basically forgot about them. And it's a real shame because everything in the game revolves around creating these things. Any chests you find will have materials needed to craft tweaks. Completing side quests for NPCs rewards you with schematics to unlock new tweaks to craft. And because tweaks had very little impact on the game, I quickly lost interest in doing any side quests or exploring. Why waste my time on backtracking and completing time-consuming puzzles when the reward is just going to be material I need to make a thing I don't want? There was no incentive for exploration. I looked some stuff up after completing the game, and I apparently missed 2 optional bosses because I didn't want to explore. But I was completely okay with that once I learned the reward was just more freaking tweaks I'd never use. Anyway, that's why I just stayed on the game's main path, not like it was hard. The game map labeled everything for you, including where chests were and where your next objective was. So getting lost or stuck really wasn't a thing in this game as long as you paid attention and could solve the puzzles throughout the environments. Speaking of environments, let's discuss the game's second strongest attributes, its atmosphere and overall presentation. Iconoclast's art direction is phenomenal. I'm a huge fan of its sprite-based aesthetics, and its bright colors make its environments pop. Block Rock, the game's first biome, is as loud as anything that came from the early to mid-90s, and I mean that in the best possible way. I found the area's vegetation nostalgically endearing with its odd angular geometry. The entire place reminded me of some of the old Sega Genesis games I played as a kid, like Sonic the Hedgehog, Rystar, and one of my all-time favorites, Gunstar Heroes. In fact, much of the game reminded me of Gunstar Heroes. The character designs, the explosions, how the guns fired, heck, even the color-themed names for some of the main characters. The game's singular developer cites Metal Slug as an inspiration, and you can definitely see it in the boss designs and in the game's stellar animations, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear he grew up playing Treasure's run-and-gun classic with his little brother, just like I did. I adored the game's music as well. I'm not much on music theory, but I did notice how every track incorporated some sort of mechanized clanging sound, and I thought that was a clever way to thematically connect each track. All in all, everything from its looks to its sound design meshed together well to create a unique and fun experience that teetered on that sweet spot between creating something new and evoking nostalgia. And though it's clear Iconoclasts wears a lot of its inspirations on its sleeves with its familiar game designs and tropes, that doesn't mean it doesn't pave its own path. Iconoclasts forges its own identity by excelling at its strongest attribute, its narrative. Iconoclast's story is unexpectedly deep and deceivingly dark, despite what the game's early moments would lead you to believe. Its cute, vivid graphics and Robin's adorable design and cartoonish expressions conjure a tender warmness within your tiny gaming soul that immediately gets ripped from your body the moment you watch government agents destroy your brother's house with him and his family inside. All because Robin got caught using her unsanctioned mechanical skills to help others. I don't want to do a deep dive into the game's actual story, though I easily could because there's so much to talk about. So, I beg you, if you're going to play this game, don't spoil it for yourself. You want to go into this blind to fully experience its twists, because this story is something else. It's some real Rick and Morty type stuff, man. That's what inspired this video's cold open. What I do want to discuss is the narrative's effectiveness, because this is an analysis channel after all. We want to know if Joachim Sandberg, Iconoclast's dev, tells a cohesive and interesting story. And to that, I say, yes, the dude's got some real storytelling chops. It was the story that kept me playing because I'm not that big into puzzle platformers, but to be specific, It was the characters that kept me hooked. I fell completely in love with everyone in this game, and as I tell all my students, good storytelling comes from your characters. The plot was interesting, sure, but it was how the characters dealt with the conflict that gripped me. Sandberg did an exceptional job at creating realistically flawed yet likable characters who you wanted to root for, to hate, to scream at, to celebrate with. And the world these characters lived in felt alive. Sandberg's world building was top notch and had an impressive level of consistency throughout. Lore runs deep in this game, and characters acted appropriately to their situations, approaching everything with their unique personalities and motivations in mind. If there was anything to be criticized in terms of the storytelling, it might be its delivery. As alluded earlier, the game's lore dense, and even though Sandberg does a good job at utilizing environmental storytelling, he opts for expositional text dumps more often than not. I personally didn't mind these text-heavy moments, but I know there are people out there who hate it when walls of text interrupt gameplay. There are moments of telling not showing, but considering this is an indie title developed by one guy, it's easy to chalk these moments up to budget and time constraints. After completing the game, I don't think Sandberg left any loose ends undone. Remember how I mentioned the vegetation's odd geometry? There's actually an in-game reason for their appearance, and at points the screen shakes for no reason while tiny white flakes float by. This is explained as well. Both of these seemingly immaterial phenomenons are actually foreshadowing later events and revelations. By the end, every significant conflict is resolved in a satisfying manner and any lingering questions answered. There were some story building bits that hadn't been explicitly explained, but I was comfortable inferring their meaning based on textual and visual evidence. There's so much more about the narrative I'd love to talk about and praise, like how this is a pro-environmentalism story that miraculously doesn't come across as preachy, or how it's critical towards dogmatism without being overtly anti-religious or anarchic, or how Sandberg brilliantly uses a Charles Manson quote to successfully drive home the narrative's theme and set up the game's twist ending. But I gotta stop. I can't risk spoiling anything. You'll just have to trust me when I say it's a story worth experiencing. And though the subject matter is heavy and dark, Sandberg does a good job at keeping the tone light with lots of humor. You have Mina and Royal to thank for that. But just because I enjoyed the story doesn't mean the game's off the hook for being undercooked in spots. The whole encounter with Ash, a government agent gone rogue, was a letdown. Not that the scene was bad, on the contrary, it was one of my favorite parts. But the stealth mechanic it introduces isn't even used in the game, leading me to believe it might have been cut. Near the end, a bunch of secondary characters are thrown on screen with little time given to introduce or explain them. The worst example of this was the purple-clad junior agents. They just kind of appear in a scene, get talked at in a scene, and then fight and die. It was obvious they were created just to be roadblocks for a late game set piece, which is a shame because all the other main villains were characterized very well. There's also stilted dialogue near the end. Returning to the junior agent's scene, some random authority figure conveniently explains the agent's weaknesses and drawbacks. And there are instances when a character will unnaturally explain or set up something just for that thing to be used a few moments later. The end with Royal is guilty of this. He explains the escape pods and how the doors work very unnaturally, almost in a self-aware, comical manner. Like, he might as well have been winking directly at the player while saying it. As you might have gathered, the late game does feel a bit rushed, but it's not a huge issue. Probably my biggest complaint with the game is its stupid tower. I think I was in this place for like 2 hours trying to figure it out. It's a multi-floor biome with 2 independently working elevators that require you to do tons of backtracking if you want to just use one. There were way too many one-way trips during this section, and I got frustrated frequently. The Silver Watchman fights were pretty sweet though. I also got confused with the weird nightmare part where 2 of the 3 bosses didn't even fight me. Doing some post-game research, I discovered whether these bosses attack you or not depends on dialogue choices you made throughout the game. There's nothing in any of the menus tracking your choices, so I can't tell you what I said and when, but I guess I chose correctly enough to skip 2 of the fights, so that's cool. I guess I'll never know what I did right or wrong for this part. Oh, one last complaint. Robin's sprite's eyes got on my nerves. Every portrait in the game has her with big, round eyes, but her sprite's eyes were just 2 plain dots. Nitpicky, but I sincerely hated it. Recommendation time. Do I think Metroidvania fans should play Iconoclasts? Iconoclasts deeply affected me. Once the credits began to roll, I was hit by a wave of bittersweetness. I was sad. I wanted it to keep going. I had grown to care for these characters, flaws and all. I wanted to know that everyone was going to be okay. Mercifully, scenes played during the credits, showing the characters moving on with their lives. And it made me feel better. And I think it's something you should experience. So, yes, I recommend Iconoclasts, but only if you set proper expectations. If you're going to play it, remember, it's not a great Metroidvania, but it's a decent puzzle platformer with a really great story. But be warned, the twist ending is divisive. I've heard people say they hated the ending so much that it ruined the rest of the game for them. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps confronting disillusionment is the ultimate way to connect the player with the game's characters. Or perhaps I'm just overthinking things.